lot of them would be in pain, and it was a matter of groaning and not being able to communicate. They'd ask for, God help me, and please, they're just, it's tragic what they have to go through pain on that. But when the shell went off, you weren't up looking around at the time. You were down. You knew the shelling was going on. There would just be parts of bodies if you went over and looked at them. This is a flag that I had taken off of dead Japanese on the island of Iwo Jima in the battle in World War II. This is the black sands from Iwo Jima. It's all volcanic rock. Some things you never forget.
Thank you so much to the Stanley W. Eskram Foundation for their financial support to make these interviews happen. Your support gets these World War II veterans preserved on camera forever.
I was attached to the Company A, 1st Battalion, the 1st Platoon. I took care of the 1st Platoon and part of the machine gun squad and the assault squad. The assault squad was the one I liked. I was kind of a glory hound, I guess, at that time. I liked the idea of being with a flamethrower, a BAR man, a demolition man, but that was what I enjoyed mostly. It was kind of a gung-ho outfit, and you kind of liked that business, or I liked it. I remember the night before, we were down in the hold, HMS, it was called the Duel, D-U-E-L. That was the ship that we were on. And I remember it was the place where we slept down, the bunks down there, those 6 or 7 high that you had. It was hot and one thing or another. So I got out and I wanted to sleep on the deck at night. And one of the ironic things was that I had received a small watch that had the fluorescent, you couldn't even go out on the deck with a fluorescent watch for fear that the Japanese would see from the air would see this and then would cause problems. But anyway, I remember out there at the, around 2 o'clock in the morning. We were called in, and they had the guys to come and get us, those that we were sleeping up on the deck before. And we had chow. We had steak and eggs. It was a combat breakfast, big deal. And because we were going the next morning, we were going into combat. They wanted to give you a big meal. So we went back, and they took us off the deck because early in the morning, all this shelling started. They left, and the ships that were out there, if you were out there, you could see all these ships. It was unbelievable, the amount of ships and battle wagons and other things that were there. So we were prepared to go. We didn't know what time we were going to go in there. Most of the things were LCVPs, which was a landing craft vehicle personnel. It was a boat that the front gate came down on it, and you ran out of this thing. It took a platoon, generally a platoon of guys in each one of those LCVPs. But some of the original ones that went in were alligators or water buffalo. They call them that. They were track vehicles. It was a track vehicle that was like a tank, but it had tracks on it. It would go in the water, and then would hit the beach, and it would be able to go where the tracks be able to go into the land area. So that's where we were, and we didn't go in. We kept hearing we were going to go because they were going to land at it was at 9 o'clock. I think it was 9 o'clock in the morning was H hour, and prior to that, the island was being shelled by the Navy big battle wagons and other ships, and it was being bombed, and one thing or another, and prepared for the landings, for the vehicle, or the landings that morning. But we didn't make the landing until I think it was around noon or 12:30, I think it was, after some of the original ones. And what it was, we'd heard later on that the Japanese had led a lot of the troops in there, figuring that they would take and cut everything off, and then we'd take care of all those troops that were there, that would be the end of the battle for them. They wouldn't have to worry about it. But it ended up, we went in, and not knowing what we were going to do, it was kind of ironic, because I remember landing on the beach with that LCVP. The front gate went down on us, a huge front gate on it. We ran out, and we were in sand and then volcanic ash and sand there on the island of, what do you call it? We didn't know we were going to get all that kind of stuff. And so I dug into a big, well, I didn't really have to dig into a foxhole. I jumped into a foxhole, which was a big shell crater hole. And for some reason, why, I don't know, out of my pocket, I had a small little prayer book. And in the prayer book was I can remember it, there was an act of resignation. And a resignation would have meant, hey, you're not going any further. You're going to die, and this is the end of it. This is the last prayer you're going to say. And I remember reading that thing, and I thought, my God, I don't know. And I was by myself. I didn't have anybody with me, because Navy corpsmen, because the other guys were all Navy, Marines. We were finally told to pull out of there and move up a little bit on the beach. So we moved out there, and I remember some of the first battle casualties that with Company A. I remember the first guy was Bordelon. Bordelon was a guy from down in New Orleans, and he had been wounded, and I saw that, and I thought, oh, this is it. So we were able to move in, and I treated some of the fellows that were wounded, battle wounds, and one thing or another. So we moved into an area that it was kind of like a bayonet course that Japanese had. That first night, I had slept by myself. I didn't have anybody with me. Normally, you try to get another guy with you, so he'd keep you on and off, so you wouldn't be awake all night long. But I was awake that night and scared to death. And I remember eating a thing to stay awake. It was a chocolate bar it was like eating rock. It was so hard. It was terrible. I remember that. And then next morning, we kind of gathered around. We were at the base of Mount Suribachi, at the one southern end of the island of Iwo Jima. It's where the main headquarters of the Japanese were. And that's where the famous flag raising eventually went on there at Mount Suribachi. And so we organized that same day, and we made a push up the left side of Iwo Jima along the coastline up to where we ran into a lot of heavy fire, and we couldn't go any further. So we were pulled back about another 150 yards. We went back into the rear area. That's where we set up that night and bivouacked that way. And then later on, we started having casualties. And I remember treating some of the guys that I knew, and some of these guys, I remember my lieutenant of the 1st Platoon, Company A, Vito Barzalowski. Barzalowski was a Pacific Coast boxing champion, big fella, Lithuanian fella. And Barzalowski had come over to the foxhole where I was, and George Kelleher, Billy Green, and Danny Hands, I think it was, we were there. And he was kneeling down, giving us his instructions, and all of a sudden he slumped over. He was shot from the rear. A Japanese sniper had got him, and his guts were starting to come out. So I got Kelleher and myself, and we pulled him in, because we were not more than a couple of 2-3 feet away from where he was, and we pulled him into the foxhole and tried to get contact with the people behind us, because foxhole at that time, you weren't any further than 3 or 4 feet, 5 feet away from somebody else, and it wasn't, like you run 100 yards and you build another foxhole. It wasn't like that at all. It was very close combat. Well, we finally got Barzalowski out of there, and they took him to a rear area, and at a later date I found out that what had happened, and apparently he'd been on the, they got him onto a hospital ship, and somehow they told him that he would be sterile. He would never be able to have children or anything as a result of this injury that he had his lower area. So apparently he pulled out some of the tubes and stuff, one thing or another. But apparently he died as a result of that. I mean, that was the end of Barzalowski. So I didn't have anything to do with him. I wasn't injured at that time, and that was the second or third day, I guess it was. So we kept fighting to the fourth day. I think I was pulled back. We hadn't had any special food or anything, just K rations. And we went back to a rear area and set up in the rear area. And the next morning, I think it was the fourth or fifth day, time, you couldn't put it in perspective. You kind of lose fact over, what do you call it? J.O. Wicker, Yanko Katula, myself, and I thought it was somebody else. We decided we were going to snoop around a little bit because we were in a rear area, and we thought, well, we'll go into some of these caves. So we started going into those caves, and that's where one of those, that Japanese flag, I took it off a Japanese that had been in there that had died, and I pulled it out of his, they put them around their waist to one thing or another. And we went, and Wicker was, it's kind of a strange guy, Wicker. He was with the first squad, rifle squad, Corporal Wicker, J.O. Wicker. And Wicker was one of these guys that he liked the teeth, and he would crush a Jap with a, what do you call it, with a rock or a big piece of volcanic, and try to pull the teeth out of there. He thought he was going to make money out of it. We had moved from there, kind of snooping around in these caves and one thing or another, trying to see what we could find. And I found something I thought would be real worthy that I take home. Was a telescopic thing off of a piece of artillery shell that it finally ended up, it got into my sea bag or my stuff, and they cleared it out and never got back to Salt Lake, and I don't know whatever happened to it. And the other thing that they took out of that, was, while I'm on that subject of the sea bag, I like the 45 pistol that I had. I had that. I had a carbine. I got rid of the carbine when I hit the beach. I had 50-some pounds of medical gear, and I wasn't going to carry the carbine because I wasn't in a shooting position or anything. I had the 45 also, and I thought I had enough what do you call it, because you could sit in a foxhole with a 45 like this and hold it up here, and a nip or a Japanese came to the hole where you could just pull the trigger, and that was the end of it. So I remember one day walking along. They'd already, we would be taken prisoners, even from the first or second or third day, I guess it was. And I remember walking, trudging to the front, and these Japanese looking at us. These were prisoners of war we'd already captured, but they couldn't do anything with them because the beaches were so jammed up with what he called, they couldn't hardly even get supplies into the thing, let alone get the Japanese out into the interrogation and find out certain things that they needed to know. But it was kind of spooky there. We didn't have any invasion bonsai charges that first night. We did the second night. And the third night, the Japanese tried to infiltrate our lines all the time, and they would try to get through in there in the middle of the night. So we had our problems. There was I didn't, in my position as a corpsman for Company A, 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, with the assault squad and the 1st Platoon, I didn't do any hand-to-hand combat, but we had guys in Company A, in our company, that were fighting hand-to-hand combat at night, not that first night, maybe the third night, second and third night, where the Japanese tried to infiltrate our lines and come through. And we got into hand-to-hand combat that night. So I was fortunate that I didn't get into that myself. So, in your foxhole, you'd always put your hole, if you had to dig the foxhole, the dirt and the stuff behind you, not in front of you. This way you wouldn't be silhouetted against the Japanese if they could see you, because of the dirt and the sand behind you would silhouette you. You wouldn't silhouette you. If you did it in the front, something else. We moved into a new area, new battleground area, and dug in for the night. And I don't know who it was. Somebody came up to me and told me they needed a corpsman right in front of us, one of the guys in the 1st platoon. And I believe it was Sergeant Lilly was injured, and I didn't know at the time. I knew Lilly, and I went out to see how he was. I mean, we're talking from here to the door, maybe 15 feet, 20 feet away, and so that was the front line. And Lilly was laying there on the ground, and I remember laying down beside him, and I took his helmet and I kind of pulled his head back, and I tried to speak to him, and he didn't make any noise or anything, and I realized that I guess he was dead at that time. He'd been shot or wounded, and there was nothing else I could do. And I was kind of on my knees, kneeling down when I was there, or started to get up, and all of a sudden I felt something went through my leg. It burned. And at that time, I realized then what the story was, that I was wounded. A Japanese sniper had hit me. So I started cussing and swearing, because I knew I had to be through. This was the end of my battle. I wasn't going to fight anymore. So I was able to get up and get back to a rear area, and then they took and said, you got to go all the way back to, you don't need a stretcher barrier, you can make it yourself. And so I back to where the 1st platoon was, and Rufus Egbert had jumped from where he was. He dove into the foxhole that I went into, and there was a Marine in there that was dead, and he had his M1 like this with a bayonet on the end of it. When he dove into the head first, he caught the bayonet on his foot, and the blood was squirting up about 12 inches or so, squirting out of it. And so I had to take care of him and give him a battle dressing, and I couldn't do anything about my leg. My leg hurt. It hurt because I'd been shot through the leg. Luckily, it didn't break any bones or anything. It went through the fleshy part of my leg. So I was able to take and battle dress Egbert up at that time. And somehow I got back, I don't know, maybe 100, 150 yards back to what would be a rear area. They treated me a little bit on there, and then put me onto an LVCBP, and I was taken back to the USS James O'Hara. The James O'Hara was a converted hospital ship. It wasn't like the other ones, the big real hospital ships. But that's where I was treated, because I remember there the doctors had me on the table, and they were going through this and that, and put a thing through there with gauze on Vaseline and ran it through where the hole was and left that inside there. I guess it helped heal it up. You couldn't do that in combat, but you might be in a rear area. So I was there aboard that ship, and I'm trying to remember. Oh, that ship went with wounded personnel, was taken back to Guam. And I was taken to Base 18 Hospital at Guam. And next to me was a pilot that had flown over, not Iwo Jima, Chichijima. He was on a battle run to go over Chichijima. There was Hahajima, Chichijima, and Iwo Jima, the three little islands there. And he was there, and I was put next to him in a bed. So anyway, he was there, and we kind of talked. I mean, you know, I wasn't in a lot of pain or anything else. I mean, this is what you'd call a Hollywood hit, where the bullet would go in and out, and you didn't break any bones, and you weren't close to death or anything. It's like if you want to get shot, that's the way you would want it. So that's where I was. From there, I went to no, I stayed at Base 18 Hospital at Guam. That's when I was picked up by the British aircraft carrier HMS Reaper. They come from Australia, I guess, somehow, and picked up about 8 or 10 of us, the Marines, I guess, that were wounded, and they were going to take us back to Pearl Harbor. God, I hated that. They were sloppy, they were dirty, and the food was up spirits. You go drinking rum at 10 o'clock in the morning and 2 o'clock, and the chow was bad. It was just, I didn't like it on there. And their battle preparations on that thing, they took some target practice just before we got to Pearl Harbor. They couldn't hit anything, and I thought, well, we can't win any wars with these guys. The British were just terrible. So anyway, I was unloaded back there, and then from there, they put me on a, and I was taken back to Camp Tarawa. In the meantime, the battle at Iwo Jima, it only lasted about 30 days, I guess it was. Some of these battles were supposed to be like 10-day things, and they didn't work that way. So anyway, that's where I was, and I waited back. We were back in Hawaii, back in the training area where we'd started from. Somebody mentioned something about a Navy Cross, and I didn't know anything about it. I didn't have anything about writing it up, and it depended on who your officer was, or somebody saw you do certain things that recommended that, but it never came through. And a later date, somebody said something about Silver Star and one thing or another, and I remember I had already had a battle thing with a Bronze Star with a Combat V, but the Silver Star I didn't get until I was back in the States here, and they called me to San Diego, wanted me to go to San Diego for something. So I went to San Diego, and they presented me with a Silver Star at that time. I had treated a lot of the fellas that I didn't know. I mean, I knew the respective fellas that were in Company A, 1st Battalion, whether they were the Assault Squad or whether they were the 1st Platoon. I mean, you know those guys. I mean, you lived with them. You were in a tent with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. You were in this. You slept with them. You had chow with them and all this. Some of the guys I didn't know. I mean, they were from different regiments or different battalions, and one thing, or you did what you could, and that was it. Some of them they were just. They were rather ghastly. They'd almost make you sick because there would be so much blood, and you couldn't determine. I'm not a doctor. I couldn't determine whether there was a fracture of a bone or whether the lung was missing or on a head injury. I mean, it's one thing in the foxhole, like when Barzalowski came over, and that was Lieutenant Barzalowski, and knelt down to say something to us, that bullet that gone through Barzalowski and hit J.J. Green and spun around in his inside of his helmet like this, and it fell out. The lead portion of the bullet that did that. That didn't cause any real problem or anything. I mean, at the time, it scared J.J. Green to death. He probably didn't know what the hell was going on. You know, something inside of his. You got a helmet on, and the bullet went underneath the helmet all the way around his head. Those were things that, just unbelievable things you just didn't realize. You don't run into those things in civilian life at all.
So for Barzalowski, though, you mentioned that he had guts coming out. How did you treat him? What did you do?
little bit that I did, I tried to take and put water from my canteen on a battle dressing and put that over the area where his intestines were starting to fall out and his guts were starting to come out. And I asked the guys behind me, there was Kelleher, Green, what was that guy? He was the runner. And he ended up by being a platoon sergeant later on. His wife from Texas. He was from Texas. He was in the big foxhole. It was a big shell crater hole, and we were all in that foxhole when Barzalowski came over there, and we pulled him in there, and then took Barzalowski and pulled him through to the next one where they got him back to the battalion. I don't know. I mean, I couldn't tell you where the battalion aid station was from where the front line was. All I knew it was the rear area. All I knew is that if they took somebody back there, they would have to go back quite a way. You know, distance, a lot of people think war, you're fighting from here to half a block away, but it isn't that way. In a lot of areas, you're right on top of the other fellow almost.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Could you go back and please tell us a little bit more about your role as a corpsman in general and some of the different injuries and what you would do? Like if there was arm injuries, shrapnel injuries, what were the different things that you did to save the men?
Well, these didn't really start with field medical school. This is the basic knowledge of the human body and certain things, the way they function. But then at Camp Elliott in San Diego, you started learning about look back at it right now. What do they call it? A sucking chest wound. Some of these battle dressings, you didn't give certain morphine. You didn't give it to, what do you call it? If you did, you had to write it down on his forehead if you could do that. So the man, if he was treated from the front line back to the rear area, they wouldn't give him too much morphine. You can't do that. There are certain things that you could do. And certain types of wounds, you learn how to bandage that up and what to do with it. You'd look at a wound and it would be worse than what it is, than it really is, because there'd be so much blood and other stuff around us that you couldn't determine exactly what it was. If it got back to a battalion aid station where a doctor was there and you had a field medical staff where they had places they could look at this injured man and then move him from there to a rear area or get him back aboard a ship and take him out to the hospital ship, because you didn't have a hospital there. You had a field medical battalion that did the best they could. I mean, it didn't have a great big tent or anything else, you know. There were guys that I knew were in a foxhole not far from where we were, that the Japanese artillery came in, and I knew the guys were there, but when the shell went off, you weren't up looking around at the time. You were down. You knew the shelling was going on. There would just be parts of bodies if you went over and looked at them. But I mean, you knew they were dead. That they couldn't survive any artillery things like that. They were enough. Oh, and that was the other thing. Made me think about it. The Japanese had a unit. It was almost as big as a truck almost. What it was a missile, and it had a ramp, a wooden ramp. And they put this thing on there, and all of a sudden you could hear this thing. You scared the death out of you. And the thing was up in the air, and all of a sudden it was flopping around, and it couldn't go anywhere. It was one of their, what do you call it? I don't know what the hell they called that thing. It was something else. And what was ironic about it was the fact that one night we had dug in, and there was a red, what do you call it, hanging on the bush that the engineers had put out there. That right next to it was a live explosive. But it was one of those things this huge bomb like this that had gone off that didn't explode, and it was landing right next to me. Oh, scared the death out of me. I'll never forget that noise. That noise, I heard that noise. As the thing went up the ramp, it made a... And when it got in the air, you could see the thing, it was just tumbling. It wasn't a thing that the Japanese were proud of, I guess. It was something they were using. Funny you would bring it up like that. I didn't even think about it. They didn't know where the troops were. I mean, they knew we had moved into the island, and they were situated. They dug in certain areas, and so they would try to use some shelling and one thing or another, or machine gun fire if they were in pillboxes or other things. And their field of fire, if you were cross over there, that's all they had was a small area that they could shoot through. They would pretend some of them were dead. They would allow the troops to move in behind them. They'd take whatever shells that they could, shots at the troops that were going through the areas. It wasn't a living situation where the Japanese were going to come out ahead on this thing. Nothing. I mean, the troops that were on the island of Iwo Jima, there were 2 divisions, the 5th Marine Division and the 4th Marine Division, and they brought the 3rd Marine Division, which was headquarters. They were still out at sea. So as the troops became tired and one thing or another, and they needed rest areas, then they would bring in part of the 3rd Division. We had medical gear. You had medical syringes, morphine syringes, which would take care of any pain that you had. It was just a small little tube that you just broke the end off of this and put it in and give it an injection. But you had to mark down on that injured Marine when you gave that, what he called. So he wasn't going to be evacuated to a rural area and given another shot for pain relief and one thing or another. Some of the wounds that you saw there were so ghastly looking. I mean, from the standpoint of as much blood and stuff with these fires, you didn't know how bad it was. You tried to take care of what you had with battle dressings, and you had compresses and all the medical gear that you needed. I mean, you figure 50 pounds of medical gear that I had. That's a lot of stuff to carry along.
What kind of things would the wounded men, the seriously wounded men, what would they be saying to you as you're treating them?
Well, a lot of them would be in pain, and it was a matter of groaning and not being able to communicate. They'd ask for, God help me, and please, it's tragic what they have to go through pain on that. I mean, here, looking back at my, I was happy. From the standpoint, I knew I was going to get off of that island. I didn't want to stay there any longer. I mean, I'm not stupid, but by the same token, I'm not that much of a hero or anything else that I want to stay there and fight. I wanted to get out of there, I mean, like anybody else. So with most of these people that were injured, there were a lot of moans and groans. You couldn't distinguish any particular thing about them. You did what you could to help them to get back to a rural area where they could be treated.
Mr. Cram, you love life like other people. You don't want to die. But when you are a corpsman and they call for corpsmen, you have to expose yourself to go treat the wounded Marines. What is that like, putting yourself in such a vulnerable position?
I don't think you had time to think about things like that. I mean, you were trained to do certain things, and if something came up that maybe a squad leader called for a corpsman, I need a corpsman. You'd go where you had to go. I mean, it was you didn't think about things like that. I don't think I thought about how long I was going to live or whether I was going to die or not. I think maybe at one time I may have thought about that, but you kind of get over that. You do what you can and hope that it's the best.
And as a corpsman, would you say something to the Marines to kind of perk up their morale? What would you tell them as you're treating them?
Well, a lot of them were in so much pain that it was moaning and groaning, and you didn't really communicate with them. They talked about how much they hurt or this or that, and I tried to comfort them from the standpoint that we're going to get you back to the battalion aid station. We're going to get you treated and this and that, and in hopes that these guys would give them some encouragement to hang on longer. Of the 240 some in an infantry company like Company A, 1st Battalion 26 that I was in, we had, I would say, almost 200 of those people were wounded in one way or the other. That as a battle casualty, whether it was WIAs, wounded in action, or KIAs, or our form of government, I think, is the finest in the world. I mean, there's nothing that can beat it. I mean, I don't go along with these other countries. I think some of them are moving towards our form of government, and more power to them to do this. So that's about all I can conclude.
The last question, Mr. Cram, for now, what kind of man do you want people to always think of you as?
Just a man that loved his family and looked for the better part of the world. That's about it.
That was perfect, sir. And I have no doubt people think of you that way. I mean,
well, it's very nice of you to get all this, spreading all this on me here. Oh, this is for the Silver Star citation. This is a citation. For conspicuous gallantry, intrepidity, while attached to Company A, 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, in the section against the enemy Japanese forces at Iwo Jima in the Volcano Islands, February 22nd, 1945. Although severely wounded in the right thigh when his company became the focal point of a devastating enemy artillery barrage, which lasted for several hours, Cram persisted and refused to be evacuated to leave the men who depended upon him for medical aid. And fully aware of the personal risk of exposing himself to the intense hostile fire, he ran along the front lines, testing the many wounded and supervising their evacuation. By his heroism and voluntary service in the behalf of others in the force of extreme personal danger, Cram upheld the highest expectations of the United States Naval Service. For your president, signed the Secretary of Navy. This is my picture. I'm on the left side here. James Lee is the small one, and Tassio, they were the Navy corpsmen.
Got it.